in our discussion about sexual violence, we're not going to talk about some of the more nuanced considerations that are worthy of exploration in any discussion involving sexual violence. So about the prevalence, and just to give you a little bit more idea of the nature of it and how serious it is, victims of sexual assault are significantly more likely to suffer from depression or PTSD. They're much more likely to use alcohol, oftentimes to self-medicate, and even more likely to use illicit substances. And along with the depression, they're also considerably more likely to commit suicide than people that have never experienced sexual assault. So after it occurs, there's a lot of issues and challenges that can make the victimization experience linger, so to speak. They might be confronting somebody that they know. Recall that most sexual assault is committed by someone that you know. So odds are, if they're going to confront the person or take them to court, it's going to be someone that they know. And the people that might be involved there might be experiencing PTSD, including the victim specifically. Exactly what happened, the nature of everything might not be clear. There might be two different stories. And as I've already alluded to, right, there's so many emotional and psychological consequences. Right, on one end of the spectrum, they may try to compartmentalize and never talk about it and hide themselves while it all wells up inside. And then on the other, you might just see somebody who's completely overwhelmed with grief. That either is totally normal, and so is everything in between. And there, as I've noted about confronting the attacker, when I say encountering the attacker, down here I just mean more of they might just be walking down the street or walking into a gas station and run into them, and having to prepare to handle that. It kind of creates this sustained trauma, meaning this long-lasting trauma, because for who knows how long, every time they walk into any gas station, they're going to be having this fear in the pit of their stomach of, oh my gosh, what if I see them? In terms of the psychological impact, to be sure that it doesn't end after the incident ends, but how people respond to and try to help or not victims can help or hurt their healing. And oftentimes you see what is called the silent response to rape, which is all of what's going on in your head, right? Versus the compounded reaction, which is your initial reaction to the incident is then compounded by everything that happened after the fact. So what's interesting is that in court, oftentimes, for a long time, they would try to bring it up a victim's sexual history. So how many partners have you had? Have you slept with the offender? Have you, all sorts of questions about their sexual history. But now if you imagine sitting in a court, already having to make the difficult decision to decide to report, and then going through the experience, having to relive your assault over and over again, having to face your attacker, face their family, and then you're sitting on the stand, and they ask you about all the people you've slept with. Now imagine a room full of people, probably including your family, your friends, and you having to rehash your sexual history. It's a pretty traumatic experience. So there's been a lot of advocacy for trying to eliminate this, okay? Because it's interesting, though, because the victim's sexual history is fair game, but the offender's is not. So, unfortunately, however, there's a lot of criticism about rape shield laws because although they're built to protect the victim, they typically, there's a countless number of exceptions, okay? So, so there's so many ways around it, right? Like, there's so many exceptions. So, victim sexual history still comes up in court quite often. So there are many barriers to reporting rape. Some that can be more personal, right, like your intimate feelings, your life experience, and then the situational ones can be more specific to what actually happened. And then there's also about your access to getting resources and to reporting, and then systemic level barriers that are embedded within the criminal justice system that make it difficult or unattractive, I should say, discouraging victims from reporting. And you can review these on your own. If you have questions, let me know. So obviously, being that y'all are college students, you should be acutely aware of the high rates and risk of sexual violence on college campuses. In fact, the with what you know is still smaller than the reality. Whatever rate you think it is low, because an overwhelming majority of college campus rapes are never reported. The victims never come forward about them. In fact, it's as high as 95%. 80% of survivors knew their attacker, right? We've touched on this. That's the same in the general population. About 3 out of 5 rapes occur in their residence hall, in their dorm. So you can imagine now you have to continue to live in that dorm in the place that it happened, and with your perpetrator may or may not living down the hall, right? And interestingly, male college students are 5 times more likely to become a victim of sexual assault than a male student or male non-student of the same age. And but with that said, it affects both males and females regardless of their sexuality. So whether or not they are gay or straight or lesbian, does not, bisexual, does not, it affects us all. And however, transgender students are actually at the highest risk of all college students. So what I found to be particularly interesting about this was that there's a large amount of people college men, that in a survey recognized that they had used coercive behavior to get sex. But when asked if they'd ever committed rape, they said no. And when confronted about those behaviors constituting rape, they said, well, no, that's not rape. So the definitions didn't line up. Right? And 1 in 12 men admitted to acts that actually met the legal definition of rape, and yet still denied that they had committed rape. Almost half of the women who've been met the definition of rape didn't consider what happened to them to be rape. My point being is, when we see rape in a textbook or a movie, we hear other people talk about it, it's real easy to identify it. But when it happens to us in our own lives, we often look for reasons to make that not be the case. It's because it's easier to live with that. It's easier to cope with and move on from even a less serious form of sexual assault than to think of yourself as having been raped. So what about college campuses may explain these rates of sexual violence? Well, surely drugs and alcohol should be the first ones in your mind, right? But it's also you're developing your sexuality. You're in close quarters with plenty of people of both sexes, and you're curious and you're sexually maturing at this point, I should say. Many of you are getting freedom for the first time, right? You don't have parents everywhere. You can do what you want when you want. And why not when you're in a party atmosphere like college, right? And there's limited supervision, right? We're here for you, but we don't hover over you the way your parents might, right? So a side note here that I want to touch on real quick before we go any further is this concept of diminished capacity. So this is connected to incapacitation. So this is when a person can't consent because they're drugged, asleep, unconscious, maybe mentally just underdeveloped. This often results in self-blame when people are sexually assaulted while they have under diminished capacity, right? And they blame themselves for drinking or doing the drugs, and they get frustrated with themselves that they can't remember more. So what exactly is consent then? Well, consent is an agreement made between two parties freely, without coercion, to engage in sexual activities. And it's rooted in communication. You have to be able to talk communicate through behavior or words, right? But it's based on a mutual decision. If it's one person's decision, it's not consent. So some questions to ask when determining whether or not it's consent is, were both parties old enough to consent? Did they both have the mental capacity to? And did both participants agree to take part? Now, granted, there are plenty of times where this goes into the gray area. In fact, more often than not, it does. But these 3 questions are a good starting point. Okay, one way to think about consent is to use the acronym FRIES. So first, is it freely given? Right, you made it with no pressure, manipulation, you weren't drinking, you were stone cold sober. Okay, that's freely given. Then you've reversible, meaning you could change your mind. It doesn't matter if you are both naked in bed, if you've done it before, you can change your mind at any point about what you're doing with your sexuality, okay? You're informed, so you actually know what you're getting yourself into, right? So, for example, if somebody tells you that they're going to use a condom and then they don't, and you don't find out until after the fact, that is not an informed consent. Okay, enthusiastic means that you want to do it. You're not doing it begrudgingly. You're not doing it because you feel like you have to. You want to. And lastly, it is specific. So you're consenting to the specific thing. It's not global. It doesn't apply to everything. So looking at our own university, we have a pretty good definition of consent here. I am not going to go through these in detail because they're pretty similar, but I urge you to look through them and really think about how we understand consent and what our expectations are for consent here on campus. Especially because on campus, one of the more likely forms of rape or sexual assault is drug facilitated. And we've brushed on this a touch, but it's one of the things about drug facilitated sexual assault. It's drug or alcohol, I should say. This is when a person uses drugs or alcohol to gain access to have sex. So they may be feeding you drinks the whole night, or they may, encourage you to keep drinking. They might just keep bringing you a drink and, oh, that's so awesome, let's take another shot, and just keep going to get you as drunk as possible to take advantage of you. But it's so underreported for many reasons that all rape and sexual assault have in common, but also for a few unique ones. Okay, so shame, blame, and fear is common amongst all rape victims. However, because they were drinking or doing drugs, they might be concerned that they're going to get in trouble for underage drinking or for possession of and use of illicit substances. Okay, and sometimes the drugs metabolize quickly, so it's hard to know if a person was intoxicated, to be able to identify if that was, whether or not it actually was drug-facilitated assault. So these are some of the drugs that are used, Rohypnol, roofies, if you've heard of that. But if you had to guess, what do you think the most common substance used is? Alcohol it is. Okay, which brings us back to victimization on college campuses. Have that in mind. Okay, it's found to be involved in almost 85% of all acquaintance or date rapes. And if you are too intoxicated, you cannot legally give consent. The law will not recognize it. So if you're and it doesn't really matter about your blood alcohol content. Now, to be sure, there is so much gray area here. Right, if both partners are blackout intoxicated and don't remember anything, that's when consent gets real tricky. So alcohol can be problematic for both the victim and the perpetrator for a lot of reasons, and I encourage you to go through these on your own and think about these. But the one I really want to touch on here is that for the alleged perpetrator, right, if they're intoxicated as well, then they may not know that. They may misinterpret it, right? Miscommunications happen all the time when people are intoxicated. So throwing sex in the mix makes it just infinitely more complicated. All right, if you have any questions or concerns, let me know. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something new.